random bits to talk about today. I do want to keep talking about the micronutrient studies, but not today. Yesterday, I drew a card in my power deck just for fun, this deck, and it was card 13, which is feminine. And it says the world is bereft of feminine consciousness. To bring Mother Earth back into balance, we must bring back our awareness of her. Language is a barrier between us, but women has always communed with women in an unspoken language. Her roots are entwined with the essence of Mother Earth, for she too is feminine. And a lot of my trip to the island was about this connection. And I was driving and I actually had the thought of how women are more connected with nature. I don't know what it was exactly, but I think I was observing people fishing in the river with their big rubber suits on, and they were men taking pleasure in pulling fish out of the water for some strange reason, and there were no women doing that. So there's just a lot of actions that women don't do. It's not part of what we find interesting or talk about or do or whatever the heck. So I can't remember what it was that arose in my consciousness about that, but then I drew this card later that day, which was saying the same thing. Let's see what card I draw for today. What's happening today? Today feels very embodied and peaceful, like I'm not thinking about what I need to do next. I'm just really there. I went for a walk with somebody and feeling really present. And let's see what comes up. Creativity. Creativity is part of your future. Da 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 da. Today I'm not focusing so much on creativity, but that's been the theme for weeks. And one thing that relates to is last night I was falling asleep and I felt the urge to get up and write something down. And I don't usually feel that. I usually have gotten it out of my system, or I drift off and don't bother to get up and write something down if something arises in mind. But I was writing out stuff for this thing I'm creating, and I forgot to write down the word creativity. So I got out of bed and I added it right there, because I wrote down altruism, nature, women, like feminine from that card and other things. And then I had to add creativity. And another interesting thing about the feminine card that day was that I got an email from Intentional Peer Support. And it's one of their updates. And then there was an article written by Sherry Mead. And it starts with, because many mental health practices are grounded in a pathological framework, it is not uncommon for people's experiences to be interpreted as something wrong with them. Too often ignored are environmental, relational, cultural, and spiritual considerations. When these aspects of people's lives are not part of the helping conversation, meaning becomes filtered through a very narrow lens, and people begin to understand themselves as ill or the problem. And then I realized that doesn't say anything about women, but I scrolled down and this article does say something about women. And I don't want to read everything she wrote, but later on it says, this process for building community and building voice is important as we begin to think about challenging some of the current trends in mental health. Actually, this article is genius. It says, although we are beginning to see more inclusion of consumer voice in policy and practice, it is a voice that's being decontextualized. People who end up using mental health services, by and large, have learned about mental health, mental illness, from having had their experiences interpreted for them. And so when they're asked questions like, what works? They often respond by saying, more services, and specifically, more medications. After all, they've been told their very lives depend on them. I'm going to save this article because it's really good. So that's probably on the Intentional Peer Support website. And it's interesting that she languages it in that way, because I've discovered all of that, and I've done a process of talking with myself to create new context and new understanding about everything that I've experienced for myself, and not buying into how I've had my experiences interpreted for me. So that article is really good. I recommend reading it. And the other feminine thing that came up yesterday was that I got an email from West Coast Mental Health Network Society, and they have a message from the outgoing administration regarding women and female empowerment. And it says 70 to 80% of those who are drugged and incarcerated under the guise of modern day mental health care are women. Calling women mentally ill or crazy in order to subjugate and control, to abuse and destroy is simply a practice that cannot be tolerated under any mental health system. The paternal big brother of patriarchy scenario that plays out over and over in history, where women are subjugated, killed, kicked out, objectified, raped, pushed aside, forced into asylums, drugged, and incarcerated, is a karmic debt where everyone suffers in the end. The change needed is one where women are empowered to be women, to be who they are, and to think how they think. Forcing women into a male-dominated box only serves to create more war, pestilence, and destruction in the world. That is simply not sustainable. So I'm not saying I endorse exactly those views or anything, but it was interesting that there was this feminine theme thing happening yesterday, and I got an email about that post. And I didn't know that 70 to 80% of people incarcerated via mental health are women. So if that's true, that's not good. And the good news is that one can end that incarceration for oneself. And that's the next little theme. I started watching something that I clicked on in Ryan Eliason's emails. He sends a lot of emails, and I think I watched the first thing ever months and months and months ago, and I haven't watched anything since. But this one said, free training, how to become a virtual coach. Since I'm considering framing my creation as coaching in some way, I thought, okay, well, I'll click on it. And it's by Eben Pagan. And I've watched half of the first half an hour video. And it was interesting. He was saying that coaching helps with transitions in life, and that we go through a lot more transitions in life nowadays because our lives are more complex, or we change jobs more, change relationships. So we as humans experience a lot more transitions than we used to. And they said coaching is supporting someone through a transition in their life. And it reminded me a little bit of when I was on this committee for the health authority, sitting as a person with lived experience, and it was called the Transitions Committee. And it started out all beautiful and speaking about wonderful things, about the transition is about the person and person-centered transitioning and all these wonderful areas of one's life. And then pretty quickly it moved into, this committee is about transitioning people, whether they say they're ready or not, from their psychiatrist care at the mental health center to their GP or general practitioner. So this was the mandate of the province. It was a higher mandate. So it was more about creating a document for the clinician to fill out when the person was being transitioned and all the little rules and regulations around it. And one of my points that I raised was that, and I feel this is true, that if somebody is really fully being supported in all areas of their life, they will naturally transition. They'll naturally transition to a GP. They'll naturally transition from the hospital to community. And I think they were saying that in other areas of the world, people get mental health help from their GP and not this very specialized mental health treatment. But the trouble is that a lot of the psychosocial supports are tied in with whether you're seeing a psychiatrist at the mental health center. So it's really complicated. But I said in that meeting, I said, I'll transition myself. I don't need, when I'm ready and I'm well, I'll transition myself. I don't need somebody to fill out paperwork. I'll just go to my GP. I'll say, thanks, this was wonderful. Bye-bye. If somebody needs all this hoopla to transition to a GP, they're probably not ready. And then they went ahead and experimentally transitioned a bunch of people from the more specialized care of psychiatry with the clinician and all of that, and transitioned a bunch of people to GP to see what would happen, because they can come back, and if they come back within 6 months, they can have their file reopened without going through a big intake interview and all that traumatizing stuff of trying to convince someone and wait to get help when someone needs help. And I don't know if this is totally true, so don't believe what I'm saying here exactly, but from my experience and from the bits I did see, I knew somebody who was transitioned to a GP who ended up ending their life. And then I ended up in the hospital shortly thereafter, because it was really traumatizing that they just create these wonderful ideas of transitioning people to GPs, and then somebody loses their life because they didn't have a clinician. And as crappy as that care is a lot of times, it can be a real fast track to get someone into a hospital, which is never fun and it's traumatizing, but it can be a safe place where someone is unable to harm themselves. And then, all the harm, it's really complicated. But anyways, my point is that we can successfully navigate the transition out of the entire system. Not, I'm doing better, so I'm going to transition all my medical care and my prescriptions and everything to my GP, and I'm going to see my GP for all that instead of the psychiatrist. I have stepped outside all of that. I was never transitioned to a GP because I transitioned myself off the meds. I transitioned myself out of the whole system. And we as labeled people, we have unique areas of life that we're working on and unique transitions. And we could think, I'm doing better, I'm going to not need to see my psychiatrist. I can go and get my prescription drugs from my GP, or we can be done with all of it. We can transition ourselves out. Because if we don't transition ourselves out of all of it, then they'll transition us to a GP who has even less knowledge about helping us taper off this crap. They'll never recommend that we taper off this crap. Very, very rarely. So I don't know if I should have said all of that, but the word transition in terms of coaching made me remember my time being on the transitions committee and feeling like, wow, maybe something can be done to change the system to make it better so people have smoother transitions from this type of service to that type of service. How about stepping outside all of it? How about transcendence? I was reminded of something else regarding this transition-y thing, and I want to put it in there, that I made the point that it would be better to tell people new to the system this more intense psychiatric care and the clinician and everything is about a 2-year process. Set up those expectations from the start, but don't transition the poor people who maybe only know their psychiatrist and their clinician and only know a system that says you're going to be in this for the rest of your life, and then are all of a sudden told you're going to be transitioned to a GP, and a huge percentage of people don't even have a GP. And then a lot of it was created around billing codes in order for clinicians to speak to GPs. So again, all this money going into conversations between professionals to transition these people. Let those people age out or whatever happens, and set up a new system for the new people coming in. But they didn't do that. And again, it doesn't matter because it all can be transitioned out of. We can step out of the current trends in mental health. We can step out of the currents that will drown us. And another thing in the Sherry Mead article, she says, we come to the table not just as recipients of service or as people labeled with mental illness, but as people who have rich, meaningful lives. People whose experiences have multiple contexts, and we can begin to rock the boat. Quote, it is only when the force of the group and tradition loses its grip, the individual can reflectively question the legitimacy of norms and move beyond merely conventionally justified beliefs and values. Which was a quote by Meehan, whoever that is.